Hey, so you are looking at what I would call my ready for rough sand surface. This surface is ready for rough sand and all the edges are dry, everything is absolutely dry. But when you're rough sanding, you're taking out these big edges that you're looking at here, all the imperfection on the wall, all those work lines. This is the before factor, before sanding. After your two coats on everything. Two coats on corner beads, two coats on flats, two coats meaning tape. Sorry, two coats meaning pre-fill, tape, and coat. That's what two coats mean here. So you pre-fill, you taped, and you coat. You hit your nails twice or a thick layer of nail. You've given it a big thick layer. And again, so here we are and we're gonna do some rough sanding. There's some debris in there. There's some, characteristics in there, but this is sanding. The most important thing to remember before you begin sanding is that your wall is absolutely dry. If you're anything, as a matter of fact, not just your walls, your corners, if you're sanding, rough sanding, it needs to be dry. Now, this you're looking at is a sped up version, and we'll go through this pretty quickly until you see some of the other details. Now, sanding to me is very simple in terms of what am I doing? I'm picking a pattern on the wall and I'm going over it left to right, up and down, and that's all that's there. In this example, I am in a very dramatic suit here. I'm in a very dramatic scenario where I have a machine. And you may not be in that scenario. Maybe all you have is just a pole sander. Pole sander has been what we've used for the years, so you can always use the pole sander. But as my work advanced, I've realized that I have to up my game a bit. So I definitely like to use the machine. I work hard at getting better at the machine all the time. And as you can see in this example, I have a vacuum on the machine that takes up the air. Now that's courtesy for everybody when you have a vacuum on your machine because quite frankly, you're going to be in dust all day. Now, do you want to be in dust all day? Not me, right? And I've also said before that you want to do as less sanding as possible. Not only that, but if you're going to be sanding with the hand sander, you're going to work your body out. You're going to be tired. And by the time you finish sanding, you're going to want to go home. Nothing's wrong with that either. You can go home, but it does take a lot out of you. When you sand without the machine, you're drinking a lot of water. So what you see me in here is a dramatic suit that is extremely hot, by the way, but it keeps me protected from all the dust. We're going to go into this particular aspect of the work a little bit later, but the most important thing to remember is that your surfaces are 100% dry. You've done your best, in my opinion. You've done your best to get everything ready for this particular process in the sense that, okay, I'm not going to miss a butt joint or I'm not going to have to go back over anything. You know what I mean? After this, I can start skimming type of mindset. And other things to keep in mind, but those are the biggest things to keep in mind. I'm doing one big area. I sand once. I put the tools down. I took off all the dramatic clothes. I wash myself up. All I'm going to do now is skim coat. So if you're doing it like that, I recommend that you start investing in the sanding machine. In this particular example, as you're seeing again, I'm hitting one wall at a time, slow and steady. This is the real speed that I'm going at. So, you can see that it's generally light work, so to speak. I technically want to hit the walls first. I focus on the walls first, and then I focus on the ceiling because the guy that taught me always says that when you finish the ceiling last, the idea after finishing the ceiling last is that you're walking out of the room, you're walking out of the dust. You don't want to have the dust completely falling on top of you, right? I know it's kind of counterintuitive in the sense that, hey, I'm sanding, I got all my strength, I want to do the hardest part first. Sometimes you want to do that. You want to do the hardest part of the job first. You've got most of your energy, so you do the ceiling first. But then, that does not give you any time to get away from the dust, right? On top of that, when you finish with the ceiling last, when you leave the room, the dust settles. By the time you come back in the room, you're really ready to work, right? There's no downside to doing the ceiling last. But that's generally it. There's no big secret behind it. You use 80 grit sandpaper. You could use 60. I wouldn't. You use 80 grit sandpaper. You could use 100 grit sandpaper. You could use 120 grit sandpaper. The grit sandpaper, as they progress in numbers, give you a better finish, right? There's more work into the higher grits. So if I have an 80 grit sandpaper and I'm sanding, that means the guy who's using 100 grit sandpaper is sanding more. There's nothing more than that to it. That's it. Although sometimes the 80 grit, the 60 grit, why I wouldn't use a 60 grit as an example is because sometimes it's so aggressive. The marks are so strong. It cuts so quickly. So I tend not to do that. But, to each their own, realistically speaking. In this example, you'll realize that I don't use any of the smaller tools, such as like the sanding pole. I don't use it. And the reason why I don't use it is because the sanding machine goes all the way into the corners. It does everything for me. It's a beautiful piece of machine. I take full advantage of it. I don't do the details now because this is not the time to do detail sponging. That comes in final sanding. This is just a rough sand. And again, the main objective is to get rid of all the hairlines, all the small little spots, little here and there. And I highly recommend to sand the entire wall. Do not just sand what you worked on, sand everywhere else. And if there's any midpoint, most important thing to remember about that, sanding the entire wall is, remember, since you've been taping, since you've been running the box, mud has been splashing all over that wall. And now is the time to use that machine in its roughest course to take out some of these small debris. Yes, you could wait till final sand. You could wait till final sand, and for some guys, that's what they do. But for me, hell no, because at this grit of sandpaper, it takes it out very easily. Plus, on top of that, if you just go over everything again with the final sandpaper, the 150 as an example, 180, if you're using something like that to final sand, you don't want to meet up on a big debris that needs to be cut down a lot. Let the rough sandpaper cut it down as much as it possibly can for you. The idea here is to work as less as possible. I mean, let the body work as less as possible. So now that you're doing the rough sanding, take the time to do the entire wall, all the surface of it. Do not miss a spot. Whether you use the machine or you use the sanding pole. The sanding pole is 100% acceptable. Nothing's wrong with it. I can't stop reiterating that only because even the sanding block is acceptable depending on the space. The only thing is that I'm using a machine because I have a big space to cover. So it doesn't really, there's no big deal, realistically. And I guess that really covers rough sanding, so to speak. Final sanding is completely different and it has much more details and much more nuances in regards to the sanding pole. There's a lot more to talk about where that's concerned. There's much more nuances as far as the sponge is concerned. The final sand is exactly what the painter is painting. The final sand is what everybody's touching. The final sand is what people are looking at for life, right? So that's the one that needs the detail. So as a certain advice, try your best to make sure your rough sand covers the entire wall. Your rough sand is a one-time procedure.